Hello and welcome to this first ever episode of Payara Podcast. My name is Dominika Tasasz-Sochacka and I will be your host for this episode. Today I would like to invite you to listen to this conversation I had with Rachel Stevens, Senior Analyst at RedMonk, the developer-focused industry analyst company, and Steve Millidge, a founder and CEO of Payara, the creators of Payara Server and Payara Micro, Jakarta runtimes, and Payara Cloud. We talked about open source, a topic very familiar and very important for us in the Java industry. As you will hear for yourself soon, we could talk about this for a couple more episodes, but for this one, we wanted to focus specifically on open source in the context of enterprise and to prove why open source is a good choice for enterprises. We talked about public perception of open source, common myths and misconceptions around using open source technologies in enterprise environments, security aspects of using open source, and much more. I also wanted to use this opportunity to invite you all to try Payara products if you haven't already. We have free trials available for all of our runtimes on our website, payara.fish, and we also recently introduced a special trial for Payara Cloud, which is available on our website as well. But you need to hurry as this one is only available for a limited time over the summer and early autumn 2023. So I encourage you to check it out and sign up. Okay, so without further ado, let's listen to this conversation with Rachel and Steve. Open source for all, why open source is perfect for enterprises. Thanks for tuning in and enjoy. Hello and welcome Rachel and Steve. Thank you very much for joining me for this first episode of Payara Podcast. Today we are talking about open source and why it is a good idea for enterprise businesses to use open source technologies, especially in the context of Java and Jakarta EE. So Rachel, you have many years of experience working with various clients within the Java industry, including open source businesses and open source users. How do you think public perception of open source has changed in the last 10 years, and how do you think it will continue to change?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm Rachel Stevens. I work at a company called RedMonk, and as Dominika mentioned, did I say your name right? Hold on, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's right, Dominika, yeah.
Dominika, I apologize. So Dominika mentioned I work with lots of clients in and around the open source ecosystem. And so what we do at RedMonk is help kind of contextualize what's happening in the technology landscape, how things are being adopted. And what we've seen over and over, and it tracks with what's happening in the industry overall, is that open source is widely used across the industry, both in the tech firms and the enterprise, all over the people who are doing kind of leading work and people who are doing just kind of their everyday things. Like everybody can benefit from using open source, and it's been widely accepted as a technological format that is ready for both kind of the leading edge companies and also end users alike.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And Steve, your community and enterprise versions of Payara platform are both open source. Can you explain the common misconceptions around your free community and paid enterprise open source products?
Sure. First, I think one of the misconceptions is that the enterprise product isn't open source. So the reality is both are open source because both enterprise and community are released under open source licenses. In our case, it's the CDDL license. So that's one misconception, because you have to pay for enterprise, that it isn't an open source product, but it is. And the biggest difference between them really, between free and the enterprise, is philosophy. So we have a community product that is freely available, in the sense you can download it and use it without paying us any money. So in that sense, it is free. But that is focused from our perspective on innovation. So that's bleeding edge changes, trying to get the latest, greatest standards out to developers and in their hands, and making community, move quick and try new things. And maybe we don't keep those things in the enterprise product, because the biggest shift really for us between community and enterprise is similar to the shift that happens when you adopt a product. So enterprise is there for when you are running in production and your mindset changes as a developer from, hey, I want the latest, greatest innovation, and I want it, easy to adopt, easy to get hold of, easy to try out, through to, hey, I don't want to get called at 3 a.m. in the morning because this thing's died on me and I need to have stability. So when I'm running production, my mindset changes to, I don't want the latest, greatest innovation at this point in time. What I want is stability. So our enterprise product is what we do for that. And so the difference is, the other misconception is that maybe it's something like open core, is that it's not the same software. It's like the software, the open source software with a load of proprietary stuff. And that's not what we do. So our enterprise product is philosophically different because it has a full software maintenance, which we'll probably come into in lifecycle, which is different to the community product, but it's still completely open source.
Do you, sorry, I'm just going to jump in with my own question.
Yeah.
So is long-term support then kind of how you're thinking about the enterprise product, or talk about maybe more of the differentiation set? Because I do think that a lot of the community is more familiar with that open core model, and kind of the enterprise version has things that are held back from the community version. And it feels like your method is a little bit flipped on its head in terms of.
Yeah, I would think our method is similar to, say, like Red Hat. The philosophy is the value of open source is not necessarily in the source code. It's in the actual product, in productization of that source code. So our model really is community moves quick. There's a single version, there's a single marching version. We don't go back and patch older versions of community. If you want to upgrade, or you want to get you hit a bug and you need that bug fixing, and it ends up into the community stream, which it does, then you need to upgrade to the latest binary, end of, basically. And that's the community sort of thing. Enterprise is, with Payara, we have version 4, we have version 5, we have version 6, and we support and maintain those for customers through a subscription for 10 years each. So we still have customers on Payara 4, which is old. They should really move. But we obviously, when you're in production, that's not an imperative. If it ain't broke, don't fix it type thing. So what they do get for that is still getting patches and source code changes on the 4 branch, and they do actually make it into community, but we just don't release binaries. And so our philosophy really is that you want that software maintenance, you want that software lifecycle, you want that productionization, the testing, the certification of all the components. So we still check the supply chain of those components on the older versions, and we still release those binaries.
Nice. I mean, given the number of people in the community who are still living on Java 8 in some places, it's a hard process to get everything upgraded when you're thinking about kind of the legacy systems that are in production, making money, crucial to the enterprise activities, and it's a hard thing to get moving. So it's something that makes sense.
I think that, you have that. There's a philosophical difference between what you want out of the latest thing you're developing on and the thing that you're running and making a lot of money on in production. You don't want to just try bleeding edge in production. You want to have someone to call. You want to get patches on the actual version you're running. You don't want to just do a full regression because you need to move to the next latest and greatest thing, which we don't guarantee. So the quality difference is important, actually, I think. So community, in our view, every release has to be quality, but what we don't guarantee is migration between different community releases. So for example, we might try something in community, and then we might decide, what, that's not how we want to do it. We want to change that. So we may take it out or do it differently, or make a breaking change between releases. And that's just part of it. You need to upgrade to the latest version. Enterprise, we sort of guarantee through like semantic versioning of what is a breaking release, what isn't a breaking release, and those sort of things. So you can't make breaking changes in minor releases on an enterprise. Whereas community, we only have a single version at any point in time.
And I think that really speaks to some of the challenges that enterprises try to kind of wrapping their heads around open source. I think a lot of enterprises are at this point in time familiar with open source to some degree, but in terms of, do I want to go with the pure vanilla open source project, run it myself, and be responsible for all of that, versus do I need to go somewhere where I can have some of that help with the support and kind of that path of, what am I trying to get out of this open source and what am I able to do on my own versus where do I need additional support, is I think is one of the big challenges for enterprises trying to figure out their open source strategy.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think this is where, one of the things we might touch on, but the misconception that open source is free. So, open source is free in the sense of freedom, but not so much in the sense of cost, because and there's two ways to think about it. One is obviously the license, so you have to comply with the license, and that gives you certain freedoms. But I think the one that I always find quite entertaining is the cost one. There's a sort of concept for developers that their time is free or has no cost, whereas actually one of the most expensive things for organizations is software development engineer salaries. So if your software engineers are spending time maintaining open source components or doing that software maintenance for you within your organization, checking all the software bill of materials for security patching and things like that, that has a cost. But engineers often don't see that, so don't recommend that companies pay what can be only a few thousand maybe for an enterprise subscription for a Payara or a Red Hat or something like that. They think, oh, we'll do this ourselves, but it's like very expensive to do that.
It can be expensive to maintain, and I think it's even more expensive for people to write their own. And I think one of the things that really struck me about what you were talking about is in terms of cost is I think sometimes when you're a lone developer tackling a problem, trying to get just a solution working, just the ability to do something on your own, to just download what's available, get something, kick the tires, and the ROI can feel a lot faster when it's just you getting what you need. But when you get to the part where you have to productionize it, when you have to scale it, like it really makes sense to think about like what is this like kind of long-term ROI, and I think sometimes like that short-term building investment versus the long-term ROI maintenance investment can feel a little bit flipped depending on who it is you're talking. So like sometimes the developer, it really is like you said, they don't see that cost and they can get something kind of scaffolded quickly, but it's not just about that quick prototype. It's about getting something that's going to be long-lived and adding value for years to come in some cases.
Yeah, I think that's key. I mean, I think some developers have sort of skewed view of what's expensive. So for example, I mean, one of the funny things I found in our own team was that someone needed, it's not open source, but needed IntelliJ Enterprise. And they'd looked at the cost of that and it was like, I don't know what it is, $200 or something. And they were like, oh, I'm not going to ask for that. That's really expensive, because on their own perception, that's quite expensive. But for the business perception, I was like, what? Why ain't you just made a request to purchase it if you need it and it's going to save you time, and maybe they don't know how to do that or things. But the cost of, let's say, maintenance or working around things, the amount of times we find people who are working around bugs in an old version of Community and spending time to rebuild things or patch things, when you just think, well, you should be, take on an enterprise subscription and we take on that burden.
Like that. And I want to dive in more on the thing of they don't know how to do that, because I think that's actually a really interesting part of how you can be successful in the enterprise in both consuming and sometimes for our end users even producing open source, is do your developers and your teams actually know, like, do you have policies in place where people understand what can be used and what can't be used, and how if they want to contribute back, they can do, like if they want to contribute a bug fix or something, or if they want to have some kind of tool that they bring in, like, are those policies streamlined, clear, understood, and like not super cumbersome for people to use? Because I think that's a really important part. So it's not just, can I get the tool that I need, but like it's a broader cultural thing of, do our developers know how to get what they need?
Yeah, and we often see that, in the sales cycle for enterprises, that someone actually doesn't, they sort of maybe get that they need an enterprise subscription, but they actually don't know how to purchase it. And maybe the rest of the organization doesn't actually know they're using that open source community product within their organization, or what that means from a business perspective, and that they could have the business to manage it. I mean, one of the misconceptions we also find is that they think it's just support to raise tickets, and it's not. That's not the biggest bit, and it's not our biggest cost. As a company who maintains enterprise open source, the biggest cost is the software maintenance, software lifecycle. Keeping old versions working and up to date and checked, and allowing that stability. And what we see, I think, is a lot of organizations they're probably ignoring that open source supply chain issues, and we've seen that in major hacks and things where people are not tracking what open source they have actually got deployed, and whether they're maintaining their supply chain and ensuring that any CVEs or anything in components they're using, and because that's where cost comes in. To use open source in the free sense, you need to build a way to do that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think supply chain security is such a big topic in open source right now. We could probably do our whole own podcast on that one. I don't know if we want to pigeonhole there. Dominica, I'm so sorry. God. Dominica, did you have anything that you wanted us to specifically do before we just dive into our own set of questions?
Because you touched on security, and this is actually a one of the biggest topics that is often mentioned in conversations about open source. And I was sort of thinking, Steve, because you've got I think a lot to say around that topic, because we've been talking about it a lot in Payara, internally and externally, and to our customers, to our users, because we've got a big community user base as well. So, and you Steve, you've been yourself an open source technologies user for quite a while. How does the security of open source software compare, if it compares at all, to proprietary software in an enterprise environment? And how can enterprise users ensure that the open source applications remain secure?
Okay, I can pick up some of the points. I mean, I think one of the first things is, in some ways it's no different in that you need to rely on the creators to make that software secure. I mean, there's anecdotal evidence that maybe open source software is more secure because there's more eyes on it, but I don't know if there's ever been any studies that prove that is true. Rachel may know more on that side.
I don't have studies. I do think that there's kind of different classes of open source projects. So like if you're thinking kind of really big core projects like the Linux kernel or the Jakarta EE ecosystem, things like that are really cross-cutting across the industry, that are widely adopted, that have tons of people who are providing support and services around them. I do think that the many eyes make shallow bugs starts to hold true. I do think that as you get further down into the ecosystem, into some of the smaller libraries and packages where you kind of do just have one person or two people maintaining something, it can be it's just, I don't know if there's as many eyes as there should be. And I do think that's something that the ecosystem might need to think about in terms of how are we thinking about project maintainership. But I do think that overall, open source is like one of the misconceptions around open source is not secure. And I do think that what we've generally seen is that open source and proprietary software is always going to have security issues. And it's just inevitable that everyone will have it. And so do you want to be part of an open ecosystem where everyone's helping fix it together? Or do you want to be part of a proprietary ecosystem or something that you've built yourself where it's like party of one must fix it on my own? So I think it's thinking about, I think in some senses we're in a place where it's thinking about not just are there security issues, but how are we going to deal with the security issues is kind of where the question could be for people who are thinking about it.
Yeah, and I think there is, I mean, we can go down that rabbit hole a little bit. I think software supply chain is becoming a huge thing. And it's something that, enterprise open source companies like Payara can help solve in some ways, is that we can do that work to make sure the software supply chain for what we produce and what we release is secure. By software supply chain, I mean all the different components. Everything's built on components. Payara is built on lots of other open source components that we pull in. And what we need to do is make sure that we upgrade those and we check those for CVEs and patches, and we make sure they're fixed. And the other massive thing coming down the line in software supply chain is a legal sort of political thing that's coming out of probably the EU and in the US ultimately, which is in the EU it's called something I think it's called the Cyber Resilience Act, which is basically starting to put legal requirements for software companies to ensure that they use best practice to make secure software. And I think that has big implications for open source, in that you need to be scanning these things. You need to be checking, if you're releasing a software product, that you are doing all you can to make sure that the software is secure and your software supply chain is secure. I think in the Java world that we're in a better place than maybe some other software ecosystems, because in Java we have Maven Central is our central repository. It's pretty controlled how you get things in and out of that central repository, and there are tools that you can use to scan as you bring in dependencies if there's any known vulnerabilities. But it's a big world, and I think open source can help in that. And open source companies especially can also help in that.
Yeah, I liked what you're saying around kind of dependency management overall. I think one of the things that we're seeing right now is a lot of discussion around things like SBOMs, where people are trying to track and understand what are all of the various components of their software. I think a lot of times people don't actually know what to do with it once they have it. So I think it's one of those ones where we're I think still in very nascent stages of being able to have dependency management in a place where it's both accurate and actionable and people have it readily available. But it's a good dream. It's a good goal for us to move towards. And I think package management is a big part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I had a conversation recently with someone about it, and they were saying, okay, we use Sneak and things like that to scan our dependencies as we build our software. And that's okay if you're still building the software. I think that the problem becomes, and I think this is something where like Payara, which is like a managed runtime, can do, is that once you're in production, you may not be building the software anymore. So how do you know what you've actually got deployed in some container in a Kubernetes cluster somewhere out in your cloud, and whether that is running some vulnerable piece of software? And we've seen high-profile hacks, and I won't name them, where those sort of production dependencies weren't being updated, or had well-known vulnerabilities for years before they actually got hit. So I think there's work we can do, and there's products that probably will get created that can manage and will help do that. And I think in Payara, from an enterprise perspective, we could build that. We haven't got it yet into our product to actually scan what's in there and alert people in production. Because supply chain through CI/CD gets you so far, but not all the way.
Yeah, I think there's just so many potential injection points for attacks. So it's what packages are you pulling in? How is everything getting built? And what's running in production? And then a whole category of things in and around all of those things. So there's a lot of areas to secure. And I think it's in scanning in production is important. I agree. Scanning in production is important because you need to make sure you understand what's happening, but it can't be your only line of defense.
No, I mean,
it's kind of the COVID Swiss cheese model. You gotta have a lot of defenses.
Yeah, I mean, I think in containers now, you've even, in the old days, your operating systems would have been very closely managed, through system. Well, you'd hope they were anyway, through operation IT ops teams. But if you're sat in a container now, even your operating system isn't getting closely monitored, probably, in a production system.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, this might be another idea for another podcast. Then just security. It is a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for that. And Rachel, are there any specific industries or sectors that, in your opinion and experience, would benefit more from open source software adoption?
I feel like my answer is that it's pretty horizontal. I think everybody has, especially in terms of like infrastructure, operating systems, data products, like those are pretty cross-cutting concerns that benefit just about everybody to have some degree of openness in their infrastructure. The data in particular, I think, is becoming more and more interesting right now as we move into this world where we're trying to figure out how to make data-driven decisions. And some people are starting to think about even generative AI and how can I kind of augment my data in different ways. And so thinking about data portability and how I can get my data in and out of systems and how I can plug different things into my data, I think that's an interesting one that people are trying to work on. I think there are, of course, kind of vertical specific or use case specific things. So like the one that comes to mind for me is like there's definitely a whole category of open source projects in and around edge projects, and that tends to be kind of more IoT or like manufacturing, kind of some of those things that target specific use cases in some cases. But for the most part, I think a lot of the things are cross-cutting across industry verticals.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think going back to the misconceptions that we've mentioned, we can always turn this question around and say, and talk about how some of the industries might be perceived as not good for open source, which again, we already said that it's not really the case, because industries like finance, for example, banking, open source is still good. It's just how you use it and where you use it and what your supply chain is, as we mentioned. Yeah, so I think that the consensus is, open source is good for any industry.
I'm curious, do you have a general sense of where most of your users are running Payara? Is it happening like in their own data center? Are they running in the cloud? Is it a mix?
Dominique, we did a survey on that. I don't remember what it was.
It is a mix. It is a mix, and especially that we do have both Payara Server and Payara Micro. So there's different use cases. So it is a mix. Even one of our like biggest customers, they have a mixed environment. I think I'm talking about Rakuten specifically, both cloud and on-premise. So it is, I would say, it is a mix in general, and because our portfolio is quite wide in the sense that, yes, we've got Payara Platform, we've got Payara Micro, and then we've got enterprise and community users. So it is a bit of everything.
Yeah, I think we're running in everything, from bare metal through VMs, through public cloud VMs, through containers, and some customers have all of those things, and so it is a mix on that and environments. We need to transport all of it, and then the other area, and it is very horizontal, like you said, about which industries. We've got all sorts of industries using Payara, lots of finance, lots of government, even in defense, and then right through to gaming and those sort of really high activity type environments that change rapidly.
Yeah, I was just curious because I was thinking about industries, and I think the open source is cross-cutting, but there are definitely some projects that are more fit for certain environments than others. And so that was just the other one. Is some projects are better suited for different environments. Like we talked edge, there are some projects that are kind of more cloud focused. But that's figuring out what product and project works for you is going to be based on what are you trying to accomplish, where are you running, and all those different things. But I think most of the organizations can find something that works for them is really the answer.
Yeah, and like I mentioned just a moment ago, a lot of our customers have very mixed environments, and even they use different runtimes of Payara, either micro, server. And one of the things that I wanted to ask both of you really is, what would you say to those who are worried about the integration of open source systems with proprietary systems or programs that they run already? Because that is quite common, that you have a very mixed environment. So if you introduce a new software that is open source, does that matter that the rest of your system is enterprise, is proprietary? Are there any dependencies there?
Shall I go?
Yeah, you go for
it. Go on. Okay, I'll say a couple of things that have just come to my head. I think they're more than likely already running open source. Is the reality on many different systems. Some of the things that people worry about. We've touched on supply chain. I think that's becoming more and more of a thing. They need to be checking their supply chain and actually understand what open source they are running. Mainly, that's the same for proprietary, really. You need to understand what proprietary software you're running, but as they're normally be paying for that under a maintenance agreement, they will have something set up to manage that. So I think you need to know what you're running and which components are embedded in your applications and where they've come from and what versions are on. So that's one thing. There's some misunderstandings, I think. I don't know if they're still around too much in this day and age around copyleft and what that actually means for proprietary software, because some open source licenses, have copyleft type clauses in them. Vast majority of those just mean that if you update the actual open source software itself, then you should release that change open source. And they don't impact if you sort of link to the software or use it in binary form embedded in your software. Obviously, GPL itself needs a little bit more caution, but there are other licenses around like LGPL, which allow libraries to be embedded. So there's some level of policy really needed about which licenses people can use. And any organization now, we have one, you need an open source policy which says which licenses can I use, which license can I not use, and again that's linking into supply chain.
Then there's an angle to your question, Dominika, about how open source and proprietary systems can work together. And for me, I think the Open Telemetry project is kind of one of the ones that stands out to me, where we had a movement of people who wanted to have more standards and better portability between all of these proprietary softwares and the ability to pull them in and a standardization. And so I feel like there's also the possibility if you are really passionate about an open source project and you want it to work better with your commercial project, you can start to work with your commercial vendors or if it's your own software, but like you can work to make your systems and the ecosystem work better with open source if there is an open source project or an open source standard that you really are interested in. And I think the OTel community is one that really shows the way forward, where we see a lot of vendors now have rallied around that standard. So, I think open source and commercial are not necessarily an either or proposition, and in some cases you can really use open source to push for commercial offerings to be even better than they are.
Yeah, I think one of the big examples of that is Jakarta E and microprofile. We have what we have there, which is a really exciting project and probably something pretty new, a bit like Open Telemetry, is that we have an open standard which is developed in open source principles in an open source foundation to allow vendors to create implementations of that standard, some of which are open source and some of which are actually proprietary. But they should, you should be able to take an application from one and move it to another, because if they're compliant with that standard. So open standards through open source, I think, as you touched on with Open Telemetry, is a growing thing. I know when Eclipse Foundation started Jakarta E and microprofile, they had to sort of start to work out how you did open standards under open source, but they sort of cracked that legal and IP issues that are around in that. And so that's a very interesting model, and that sort of allows coexistence between open source implementations and proprietary implementations of open standards.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the themes that we've had kind of throughout this conversation is misconceptions. And I'm curious, do any of your communities still struggle with the Java versus Jakarta kind of move a few years ago? So I feel like, I don't know, when you're steeped in it, it feels like it's maybe not so difficult, but I think there's probably a fair number of people who are still getting their heads around that.
Yeah, I can say definitely yes, and it's one of the biggest things that we are still working on within Jakarta EE, because obviously we are members, and we work a lot on just general education about Jakarta EE and the whole move from Java EE to Jakarta EE. Well, we've touched on it before at the beginning, I think. At the end of the day, I think industry is moving quite fast, but it doesn't mean that customers or users are moving as fast. And that goes back to the technology itself, the product, moving to cloud, moving to containers. All of that takes much longer, I think, than the marketing and sales team would like it to take. And it's great. It's all out there and developers are all ready and happy to use it and test it and play with it. But the reality is that, for big businesses with large environments, that is not going to take, it's not going to take a year. It's going to take a couple of years to migrate, to understand the technology, to understand the change, to accept it and all of that. And that, I think, is also the case with Jakarta EE, with the whole move of Java EE to Jakarta EE. And we were part of this move. We were part of the campaign that was happening within the industry, within lots of vendors were involved, and it's still happening. This campaign is still going on, and people still use the old terms JEE, and that's been cancelled 10 years ago or something like that. So
JEE never existed.
Yeah. It's been this basically was I think creation of just users, and it was never really approved by the actual vendors. But yeah, so that's still existing. So I think it's going to take a while to educate the users and to for them to understand the shift. Some of the users, especially on the community side, were it was much easier, I think, and that sort of move and transition happened really quickly. But yeah, with Eclipse and Jakarta project, we are still working very hard to educate, to make sure that all of the information is out there for users to understand the change, what it means, and what it means, to their environments and what they need to do. So very much still ongoing process.
Yeah.
Was it the namespace change that was the one that was the hardest for people? Or?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things wrapped up in that. The namespace change is like a technical change, or can result in a technical change in that you need to change your code. Actually, products like Payara and Tomcat as well, and things like that, are producing transformers that will take the old applications and run them on the new namespace. So, for example, Payara 6, you can deploy something in the JavaX namespace and still onto Payara, and it'll automatically change all the namespaces of the bytecode. So that sort of technical issue we can sort of solve and ease, but ultimately you're going to have to make that code change. I think it'll be a long time before many people move those sort of applications, or some of those applications, because some of them they may not have the source code for. Once it goes into production, many organizations, in my experience, end user organizations, stand up projects to build internal systems, and then they disband the project when the internal system goes into production. And so there may not be a team around, and it may have been outsourced or something. So I think we can help with products migrate those people onto a stable platform. I think the perception change hasn't really gone through the industry yet. And I think some people think it's a Jakarta EE problem, but actually it's not. It's much wider than Jakarta EE. It's a huge industry issue. Spring's just as badly as affected as Jakarta EE, and they, that they're moving to the namespace. Tomcat is similar, and even down into some of the just basic APIs that some people use in for Jakarta in what was JavaX Inject and things like that, which are nothing. They're a part of Jakarta EE, but they're used very widely across multiple different libraries. I think the other interesting part is, which is very open source related and a bit legal, is what it did show up is that open source licenses don't grant trademarks. So Java EE was open source, but JavaX was a trademark. So, in theory, license-wise, we could have continued in the JavaX namespace. However, you could never have called it JavaX because that's a trademark issue. And so people don't get why it had to change and wish it didn't. And people did fight that battle many years ago, but lost. And the reason they lost was trademarks. And that's a totally different world of IP to licensing, software licensing. So that's an interesting thing, I think, from a open source geek perspective of and I don't think people understand. So they see it as like this terrible thing that people have inflicted on them, but it was necessary. Really, we didn't have a choice.
Yeah, it's a lot of complicated interwoven factors.
But I think that the purely technical namespace change, we can take binaries and we can move them into the namespace without people having to do any work. And these things take time. I think this is going to be I suspect that we will have customers running on the JavaX namespace 10 years from now.
That's it. Yeah. It's. I
Well,
think
not
we
that
would.
fast, but you're right.
We would like it to move faster, but that's just the reality.
And I think some people won't be able to move, let's say, because they may not have the code, or they cannot build that application anymore, or all the other things that happen in IT, where applications that are mission critical but legacy in quotes, or running their businesses, can't move.
Right.
I mean, a similar sort of thing, and this is getting back in time, is when Windows went 32-bit, 64-bit from 32-bit, there was a huge amount of applications which couldn't move and had to be done, and we have still had requests of whether Payara will run on 32-bit Java. So
Wow.
it's a so that I know it will be around for a long time.
Fair enough. Boy.
Yeah. So to wrap up, really, this conversation, what do you think are some of the most exciting open source projects out there right now, both in the Java world and in general? What are your picks, Rachel?
In the Java world, I do think micro profile is pretty exciting. I think micro profile, no, not necessarily new, but I think it has some interesting ways that we can help enterprises do good work. I think overall, what we're seeing excitement around in the industry is it's anything that's touching the generative AI space is the one that has all the new hotness right now. So I have no idea which of those at this point is going to be the front runner, because there's just so many. But I do think that is a space that's going to, I think, at some point touch all of what we're doing.
And Steve, do you have any picks?
First of all, ask: is there an open source generative AI in Java? Because I'm not, and I won't know.
I'll let you know.
I wouldn't know. I don't track it too closely.
It's one of those ones where it's like, it's in terms of like code generation and stuff. Like we definitely have people who are doing that. On the developer experience side, we have stuff that's touching the Java ecosystem, but I haven't seen anything kind of specific Java focused that I know of. But if anyone out there knows, please share.
I can, as someone who's done too much open source, I can see huge numbers of issues of open source code generated from generative AI that may be using open source code under various licenses that they've just scraped. I wonder how that works.
It's going to be a whole mess. It's going to be fun for us to figure out.
I need to retrain as an open source lawyer. So my picks would obviously be Jakarta and Microprofile, because one, I think it's actually doing something interesting around open standards. And open standards and open source, and working and picking a way through that, how you can get people to collaborate and develop standards in an open source way. And what we mean by that is code first. So you're building the standard through code before you standardize it, so to speak. Standards didn't really work that way. You would tend to specify something and then build code afterwards. So I think that's quite interesting. And Microprofile's good in that, trying to get adoption before standardizing, but allowing multiple implementations, I think, is a interesting thing. Then obviously, if we're in Java space, OpenJDK is a very interesting open source project. But the biggest one, I suppose, that's impacting us at the minute is Kubernetes. And even though it's not Java, but it's impacting the Java world pretty heavily.
Yes.
And again, CNCF are doing a lot of work on trying to standardize things that can have multiple implementations and multiple instances from different companies, which I think is good. And interesting.
We could also rabbit hole there. There's a podcast to be had right there.
Exactly, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, we can go on, but not this time. But that gives me a couple of good ideas for future episodes. So okay, great, thank you. And well, that was my last question. So thank you very much, Rachel.
I've got another question though. Can I ask Rachel another question?
Yeah, go for it.
Are you just from your perspective? We talked about open source. Are you seeing open core and some of the companies that are trying to redefine open source, which isn't really open, to be a threat to what people perceive as open source?
I do see that. I think that we as an industry are not moving in the right direction in terms of how we are defining open source. And I think we have people who take open source for granted a little bit, and that it has been established for so long. And I think we see organizations in the open core world in particular who see cloud models as a threat to their business model. And I think one of the things is that open source is a philosophy and a way of working, but it is not a business model, and it doesn't. Open source does not promise you revenue, but people are in a place where they have tried to kind of make open source their business model by finagling the definition of open source in a way that I think is harmful to open source overall. And yes, that's another one where we can go on.
That is another one, yeah. More controversial one, yeah.
Add it to the list. Controversial is good.
But yes, I think one of the things that open source is facing right now, and I think it's coming to a head, especially with the generative AI front, in terms of what does open mean in this world. And it's in the cloud world, it's in the data world, and we see all of these things colliding in some, I think, pretty impactful ways. I think also, what does open source mean in kind of the sovereign world? If we get to a place where we have different governments defining what needs to be done in different ways, like how is that going to impact the open ecosystem? Like I think we have a lot. Open source has done a very amazing job at improving how we can work as an industry, but I do think that there are some clouds on the horizon. I don't think they're insurmountable threats, but they are things that we need to come together and address as an industry.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the Cyber Resilience Act and those things. I know Patchy just this week, I think, put out a big piece saying that, you know, it basically threatened their very existence in some ways. Regulation of open source into that level, to that degree, and with strict liability is potentially an extinction event for those sort of foundations.
There's a lot going on in open source right now. So I hope to be a repeat guest with you all, because I have about 6 conversations that I would like to continue out of this.
And that's a big scary thought to end on. So, but
well, you don't need to record that one as the end on point, is it? Yeah. Probably it's an interesting topic. Yeah,
exactly. That's another interesting topic to cover. So no, thanks for that. And open source is a wide theme, and there's lots of things we can talk about around it. But yeah, thank you very much for your insight, and it was very interesting, and I hope our listeners will find it interesting as well. So thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you, Steve, for joining me for this conversation, and I hope to see you soon next time for another conversation about many topics that we can touch on around open source. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for having me.